winter of 1890 in South Dakota did not just arrive with a drop in temperature. It descended like a heavy, suffocating shroud of iron-gray clouds and biting winds that seemed to scream across the desolate plains of the great American West. To understand the horrifying secret of the Wounded Knee Massacre, one must first step into the bone-chilling silence of a landscape where the sun offered no warmth and the horizon offered no hope. This was a time of hidden history, a brutal reality, that your standard textbooks often gloss over with sanitized terms like skirmish or conflict. In truth, what was unfolding on the edge of the Pine Ridge Reservation was the final, agonizing gasp of an indigenous empire being systematically dismantled by a relentless, westward expanding power. The Lakota people, once the undisputed masters of the Great Plains, were now shadows of their former selves, confined to shrinking plots of barren land, their lifeblood, the buffalo, slaughtered to the point of extinction. It was in this atmosphere of starvation and despair that a spiritual fire began to burn, a movement known as the Ghost Dance. Originating from the visions of a Paiute prophet named Revoked, the Ghost Dance promised a miraculous restoration. The white settlers would vanish, the buffalo would return, and the ancestors would rise from the earth to walk among the living once more. To the Lakota, this was not a call to arms, but a desperate, peaceful prayer for survival. However, the American government saw something far more sinister. Through the lens of white paranoia and the sensationalist headlines of the era, this ritual of hope was rebranded as a Messiah craze and a prelude to a bloody uprising. The black files of the War Department began to fill with frantic telegrams from local Indian agents who, terrified by the rhythmic drumming and the sight of thousands of spectral dancers in white shirts, pleaded for military intervention. This massive misunderstanding created a tinderbox of tension that only needed a single spark to ignite into an inferno. By late December, the U.S. Army's response was overwhelming. The legendary 7th Cavalry, the very unit that had been humiliated at the Little Bighorn 14 years earlier, was dispatched to pacify the situation. For many of these soldiers, this was not a mission of peace. It was a chance for redemption, a dark opportunity to wash away the ghost of Custer with the blood of those they were sent to guard. Among the Lakota, Chief Bigfoot, also known as Spotted Elk, led a band of nearly 350 followers, mostly women, children, and elderly men, toward the safety of the Pine Ridge Agency. Bigfoot was dying, his lungs filled with pneumonia, his body so weak he had to be carried on a wagon. They were starving, freezing, and waving a white flag of surrender when they were intercepted by the 7th Cavalry on the night of December 28th. The soldiers escorted them to a small hollow near Wounded Knee Creek, where the Lakota were forced to camp under the watchful eyes of 4 Hotchkiss mountain guns, state-of-the-art killing machines capable of firing explosive shells at a terrifying rate. As the sun began to rise on the morning of December 29th, the air was thick with the smell of frozen sage and the metallic tang of fear. The soldiers moved into the camp to disarm the Lakota, their movements aggressive and their eyes filled with a century of prejudice. The hidden truth is that these people were already defeated by hunger and cold. They posed no military threat. Yet the atmosphere was charged with a supernatural dread. The many histories of this moment tell us that the soldiers were on a hair trigger, fueled by rumors that the ghost shirts worn by the Lakota were bulletproof. This was the shocking state of affairs. A weary, sick leader and his starving people surrounded by a vengeful military unit looking for a reason to fire. Every breath taken in that valley was a countdown to a tragedy that would leave a permanent scar on the American soul. The world was about to witness a shocking event, a forbidden chapter of our past where the lines between order and chaos, between protection and execution, would be blurred forever. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was the machinery of a growing empire coming face to face with a culture it could not understand and chose to destroy. As we peel back the layers of this cold-blooded massacre, we find the untold story of fleeing mothers and crying infants hunted through the snow for miles, a detail long buried in the classified archives of a nation that preferred the legend over the reality. The silence of that morning would soon be shattered by a noise so terrible it would echo through the centuries, reminding us that the darkest secrets are often those we try to freeze in the past. To truly understand the hidden history of the tragedy at Wounded Knee, one must look far beyond the battlefield and into the shattered soul of a dying era where a desperate people reached out for a miracle in a world that had forgotten them. The year was 1889, and the Great Plains were no longer the vast open kingdom of the Lakota. They had become a series of dusty, suffocating cages known as reservations. The buffalo, the spiritual and physical lifeblood of the Plains Indians, had been systematically slaughtered into near extinction. A strategic mastermind move by the federal government to force nomadic warriors into becoming sedentary farmers. It was in this atmosphere of absolute brutal reality and starvation that a Paiute prophet named Wovoka, also known as Jack Wilson, experienced a vision during a solar eclipse in Nevada. Wovoka claimed he had died and spoken to the Creator, returning with a message that would spread like wildfire through the black files of every Indian agency in the West. He spoke of a Messiah's promise, a world reborn where the white man would vanish under a new layer of earth, the lush grasses would return, and the millions of slaughtered buffalo would thunder across the plains once more. This was the birth of the ghost dance. To the Lakota, who were suffering under the crushing weight of the Dawes Act and the 1889 Sioux Act, which carved their lands into tiny, unusable fragments, this wasn't a call for a bloody uprising. It was a final, ecstatic prayer for history reimagined. When Lakota leaders like Kicking Bear and Short Bull traveled hundreds of miles to meet Wovoka, they brought back a version of the dance that was infused with the local desperation of their people. They began to wear ghost shirts, sacred garments decorated with symbols of eagles and buffalo, which they believed were classified spiritual armor, capable of making the wearer invulnerable to the white man's bullets. This was the hidden truth that the standard history books often omit. The shirts were a symbol of spiritual defiance, not a plan for an offensive strike. However, the American authorities, already on edge from decades of frontier warfare, viewed this religious fervor through a lens of pure, shocking paranoia. At the Pine Ridge and Rosebud agencies, a new and inexperienced agent named Daniel Royer, whom the Lakota mockingly called "young man afraid of Indians," began to panic. He saw the rhythmic, trance-inducing circles of the dance not as a religious ceremony but as a warning of a coming insurrection. His secret files sent to Washington were filled with hysterical claims that the Indians were dancing in the cold and becoming wild and crazy. The Shachamber play of the era involved a sensationalist press that was hungry for headlines. Newspapers in Chicago and New York began to run mind-blowing stories about a messiah craze and bloodthirsty savages preparing for a final war. This created a feedback loop of fear where the military was pressured to act before a single shot had even been fired. The untold story here is the profound cultural disconnect. The U.S. government, rooted in a philosophy of manifest destiny and strategic dominance, could not conceive of a resistance that was purely spiritual. They saw the ghost dance as a forbidden challenge to their authority. By the time the winter of 1890 arrived, the Lakota were at their breaking point. They were eating their horses to survive, and the government had cut their beef rations by half despite the true story of treaties that guaranteed them food. When the order came down from the War Department to arrest the instigators of the dance, it was based on a massive misunderstanding that would lead directly to the empire's end for the independent Sioux Nation. The tension was no longer just about land. It was about the hidden history of a government terrified of a ghost. They weren't just fighting warriors. They were fighting a dream that they couldn't control or understand. Every drumbeat in the Lakota camps was a final revelation of their refusal to vanish, and every telegram sent by Royer was a coded invitation for the 7th Cavalry to return to the plains and finish what they started. The stage was set for a historical legend to turn into a nightmare as the ghost of history began to walk among the living, leading them toward a creek called Wounded Knee, where the brutal truth of American expansion would finally be written in blood and ice. To understand the horrifying momentum that led to Wounded Knee, we must first examine the black files concerning the final days of the most iconic figure of Lakota resistance, Tatanka Ayotake, known to the world as Sitting Bull. By December 1890, Sitting Bull was more than just a man. He was a historical legend and a living symbol of defiance who had famously defeated Custer at the Little Bighorn. He lived in a small cabin on the Standing Rock Reservation, and while he was not a practitioner of the ghost dance himself, he viewed the movement with a weary, protective tolerance. To the strategic masterminds of the U.S. government, however, Sitting Bull's very existence was a warning they could no longer ignore. James McLaughlin, the Indian agent at Standing Rock, viewed Sitting Bull as a power play obstacle to the total assimilation of the Lakota people. McLaughlin's secret files were filled with descriptions of Sitting Bull as a polygamous, deceitful savage who used his influence to prevent his people from becoming civilized farmers. The hidden history of this moment reveals a deep-seated fear. The government believed that if Sitting Bull joined the ghost dancers at Pine Ridge, it would ignite a full-scale war that would signal the empire's end for American frontier control. On the freezing morning of December 15, 1890, the order was given to execute a classified arrest operation. McLaughlin, fearing that a U.S. military presence would cause a riot, sent 43 Lakota tribal police, men of Sitting Bull's own blood, to seize him in the pre-dawn darkness. This was a brutal reality of the reservation system, pitting brother against brother to maintain colonial order. At 5:30 a.m., the police surrounded his cabin, their breath blooming in the frigid air like ghostly spirits. They burst inside, dragging the 59-year-old leader from his bed. The shocking truth is that Sitting Bull initially agreed to go peacefully, but as he was led outside, a crowd of nearly 150 of his loyal followers gathered, their faces etched with mind-blowing disbelief and fury. The air grew thick with a supernatural tension as the crowd began to taunt the Lakota police, calling them traitors and metal breasts. In the midst of the chaos, a young follower named Catch the Bear pulled a hidden rifle and fired, striking the police lieutenant, Bullhead. As Bullhead fell, he spun and fired his revolver into Sitting Bull's chest, while another officer, Red Tomahawk, fired a second shot into the back of the leader's head. The untold story of Sitting Bull's death is one of pure, senseless carnage. As the legendary chief fell into the frozen mud, a brutal hand-to-hand skirmish erupted. Sitting Bull's 17-year-old son, Crow Foot, was found hiding in the cabin and was executed on the spot, a shocking act of violence that even some of the officers later tried to erase from the official record. By the time the smoke cleared, the last holdout of the Sioux Nation was dead, his body stripped and humiliated. The news of his killing traveled like a coded signal of doom across the plains. For the remaining Lakota, the message was clear. If the great Sitting Bull could be murdered in his own home by his own people, no one was safe. This event triggered a massive dislocation, sending hundreds of terrified Hunkpapa Lakota fleeing south through the winter storms to find refuge with Chief Bigfoot. They weren't looking for a battle, they were running from a censored government. Hit Squad. This influx of traumatized refugees only served to heighten the paranoia of the 7th Cavalry units patrolling the area, who saw every movement of a Lakota band as a forbidden military maneuver. Sitting Bull's death wasn't just an arrest gone wrong. It was the decapitation of a culture's leadership, a strategic dominance move that backfired by driving a desperate people directly into the path of the Hotchkiss guns at Wounded Knee. As his blood seeped into the South Dakota soil, the ghost of history began to weep, for the stage was now set for the final, most brutal truth of the American Indian Wars. The silence that followed Sitting Bull's death was not peace. It was the terrifying quiet before a shocking revelation of what happens when an empire decides that a dream is a capital offense. The death of Sitting Bull was not just a political assassination. It was a shocking event that shattered the last remaining illusions of safety for the indigenous people of the plains, sending a pulse of pure, unadulterated terror through the Lakota camps. As the hidden history of this period reveals, the murder of the great Hunkpapa leader acted as a warning to all who dared to dream of a world without the iron grip of federal control. Among those most affected was Chief Bigfoot, also known as Spotted Elk, a leader of the Miniconjou Lakota, who had long been known as a strategic mastermind of peace and mediation. Bigfoot was a man who preferred the council fire to the battlefield, but in the brutal reality of 1890, his reputation for wisdom was being overshadowed by the black files of the War Department, which listed him as an instigator of the ghost dance. At the moment Sitting Bull's blood was staining the snow at Standing Rock, Bigfoot was already a broken man, his body ravaged by a severe case of pneumonia that made every breath a brutal truth of agony. He was coughing up blood that froze almost instantly in the sub-zero Dakota winds, yet he knew he had to lead his people, nearly 350 souls, the majority of whom were ordinary American workers of the plains, women, children, and the elderly, away from the encroaching military power play. Their journey was a 150-mile trek through the forbidden landscape of the Badlands, a place of jagged peaks and frozen gulches that seemed to echo with the forgotten tales of a vanishing empire. Imagine the untold story of this exodus. Hundreds of starving people, their clothes tattered, their moccasins worn through to the skin, moving through a landscape where the temperature plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. They were not an army. They were a moving graveyard, a shocking revelation of the human cost of strategic dominance. Meanwhile, the classified orders of the U.S. Army were clear: intercept Bigfoot and prevent him from reaching the safety of the Pine Ridge Agency, where it was feared he would join forces with other spectral dancers. The unit tasked with this interception was the 7th Cavalry, a regiment with a hidden truth of deep psychological trauma. To these soldiers, the name Custer was not just a memory, it was a festering wound. 14 years after the disaster at Little Bighorn, the 7th Cavalry was a unit seeking a history reimagined, a chance to reclaim their lost dominance and wash away the stain of their greatest defeat with a power play of overwhelming force. On December 28th, near a landmark known as Porcupine Butte, the two forces finally collided. The shocking facts of this encounter describe a dying Bigfoot wrapped in blankets in the back of a wagon, waving a white flag of surrender as the blue-coated soldiers surrounded his freezing band. The commander of the intercepting force, Major Samuel Whitside, noted in his secret files that the Indians were in a pitiable condition, yet the atmosphere was thick with a coded sense of vengeance. The soldiers did not see starving refugees. They saw the ghost of history returning to haunt them. They saw the very people who had supposedly killed their legendary boy general. And the air crackled with a forbidden tension. The Lakota were escorted toward Wounded Knee Creek, a place that would soon become a historical legend for all the wrong reasons. As they marched, the soldiers positioned themselves with a strategic, mastermind coldness, ensuring that the Lakota were always within the crosshairs of their superior weaponry. This was the brutal truth of the frontier's closing. The machinery of a modern empire was tightening its noose around a people who only wanted to be left to die in peace. The hidden history tells us that as they reached the creek, the soldiers began to unpack the Hotchkiss mountain guns, the ultimate symbol of empire's end. These were the black files of American technology, capable of turning a campsite into a slaughterhouse in seconds. As the sun dipped below the horizon on that final night of peace, the Lakota huddled together for warmth, unaware that they were being censored from the future by the very men who claimed to be their protectors. Every cough from the dying Bigfoot, every cry from a hungry child, was a warning that the silence of the plains was about to be broken by a shocking act of violence that would change the soul of America forever. This wasn't just a flight to safety, it was a march toward an unsolved mystery of cruelty, where the true story of what happened in the dark would be buried under layers of official lies for generations to come. The geography of Wounded Knee Creek was not a mere accident of nature. On the morning of December 29, 1890, it became a perfectly designed canyon of traps, a geographical, brutal reality that ensured there would be no escape for the Lakota people. To understand the shocking truth of this hidden history, one must visualize the tactical layout as a strategic mastermind of destruction. The Lakota camp, consisting of roughly 120 men and 230 women and children, was situated in a low-lying hollow, a natural bowl surrounded by rising ridges. To the north sat a hill that overlooked the entire encampment, a vantage point that the U.S. 7th Cavalry immediately recognized as the ultimate power play position. It was upon this ridge that the Army deployed its most classified and terrifying technology of the era: 4 Hotchkiss M1875 mountain guns. These were not the slow, heavy cannons of the Civil War. They were the black files of late 19th century ballistics, light enough to be carried by mules but capable of firing 2-pound explosive shells at a rate of nearly 50 rounds per minute. Each shell was designed to explode into a cloud of jagged shrapnel, a shocking anti-personnel weapon that could shred through the thin hide of a teepee as if it were paper. The untold story of Wounded Knee is often framed as a spontaneous conflict. But the strategic dominance exhibited in the placement of these guns suggests a forbidden intent. The military had created a kill zone where every square inch of the Lakota camp was within the crosshairs of superior firepower. As the sun climbed higher, the ghost of history seemed to watch in silence as Colonel James W. Forsyth ordered his 500 soldiers to completely encircle the 350 starving refugees. The soldiers formed a tight perimeter, their rifles loaded and bayonets fixed, creating a wall of blue steel that offered no forgotten tales of mercy. The brutal truth is that the Lakota were already defeated by the cold and hunger of their journey, yet the military treated them as a threat that required a massive revelation of force. The order was given for the Lakota men to come forward and surrender their weapons. This was a mind-blowing moment of vulnerability. As the men piled their old hunting rifles and ceremonial knives in the center of the camp, the soldiers began a censored and aggressive search of the teepees. They didn't just look for weapons. They tore through the personal belongings of families, tossing aside blankets and winter furs, terrifying the women and children who huddled inside. This was the hidden truth of the Empire's end on the plains, the systematic humiliation of a people who had already lost everything. The strategic mastermind of the search was designed to provoke a warning that any resistance would be met with absolute dominance. The tension in the air was so thick it was shocking, a psychic weight that pressed down on both the soldiers and the Lakota. The 7th Cavalry soldiers, many of whom were ordinary American workers drafted into a war they didn't understand, were fueled by secret files of rumors suggesting the Lakota were hiding a massive cache of modern Winchester repeaters. They moved with a forbidden edge, their fingers twitching on triggers, their eyes searching for any sign of the Messiah Craze turning violent. Meanwhile, the Lakota men stood in the center, shivering in the biting wind, their ghost shirts providing the only classified protection they believed they had left. The shocking facts of the tactical setup show that the Lakota were effectively caught in a crossfire. If the soldiers on one side of the bowl fired, their bullets would likely strike their comrades on the other side. A strategic mastermind failure that would later lead to high, friendly fire casualties among the U.S. troops, which the black files would try to blame entirely on the Indians. This was the Canyon of Traps in its most literal sense. A desperate, starving group of people surrounded by a vengeful, jumpy military unit with rapid-fire artillery perched on the hills above. There was no true story of a fair fight here. There was only the cold, mechanical preparation for a shocking act of violence. The untold story of the women in the camp is perhaps the most heart-wrenching. They were occupied with the brutal reality of trying to keep infants warm in sub-zero temperatures, unaware that the metal muzzles of the Hotchkiss guns were already leveled at their homes. This was a strategic dominance move that bypassed all forgotten tales of chivalry or rules of engagement. As the search for weapons continued and the pile of surrendered rifles grew, the ghost of history stood on the precipice of a final revelation. The hidden history of Wounded Knee is not just about the shooting that followed, but about the shocking and deliberate way the trap was sprung. Every soldier in that valley, every Lakota mother clutching her child, and every dying leader like Bigfoot was now a prisoner of a strategic mastermind of paranoia and colonial power play. The silence of the morning was a warning, a coded message that the frontier was closing with a shocking finality. The black files of the 7th Cavalry were about to be written in a brutal truth that no amount of official censorship could ever truly erase. The canyon of traps was set. The triggers were heavy, and the shocking revelation of what happened next would become a permanent, historical legend of American cruelty. The morning of December 29, 1890, at Wounded Knee Creek was a brutal reality, where the ghost of history seemed to pull the strings of fate toward a shocking climax that would forever be buried in the most guarded black files of American military records. The tension had reached a mind-blowing level of atmospheric pressure. 500 soldiers of the 7th Cavalry stood in a tight, nervous ring around the Lakota camp, their fingers twitching on the triggers of their Springfield rifles, their eyes fixed on the spectral white shirts of the men they had been told were bulletproof. The hidden history of this moment centers on a single Lakota man named Black Coyote, a true story of a tragic misunderstanding that became the warning signal for an empire's most brutal truth. Black Coyote was deaf and did not speak English. He had purchased an expensive Winchester rifle and, in the censored confusion of the disarmament, he did not understand the command to surrender it. As two soldiers grabbed his shoulders to wrench the weapon away, Black Coyote struggled, raising the rifle above his head and shouting that he had paid much for it. In that split second of forbidden friction, a shot rang out, an unsolved mystery that remains a shocking revelation to this day. Was it an accidental discharge from the struggle, or a strategic mastermind move by a soldier looking for a reason to fire? Whatever the hidden truth, the sound of that single rifle crack was the coded invitation for the 7th Cavalry to unleash a massive revelation of violence. The shocking facts tell us that the military response was instantaneous and indiscriminate. From the ridge above, the 4 Hotchkiss mountain guns began to rain strategic dominance in the form of explosive shells directly into the center of the camp. Imagine the brutal reality as these shells, designed for Empire's end efficiency, tore through the teepees where women were nursing infants and the elderly were seeking shelter from the wind. The untold story is that the 7th Cavalry was so blinded by a desire for history reimagined, a vengeance for the ghost of Custer, that they fired blindly into the smoke. Because the soldiers had surrounded the camp in a circle, their strategic failure resulted in a shocking amount of friendly fire. As they mowed down the Lakota, they were also shooting their own comrades on the opposite side of the bowl. This was a power play turned into a chaotic bloodbath. The air, once filled with the rhythmic drumming of the ghost dance, was now shattered by the mechanical screams of the Hotchkiss guns and the shocking sounds of high-velocity lead splintering bone. The Lakota men, most of whom had already surrendered, their weapons were forced to fight with their bare hands or whatever knives they had hidden beneath their blankets. A brutal truth of a doomed resistance against strategic dominance. Within minutes, the center of the camp was a censored graveyard of twisted bodies and burning canvas. The hidden history of the 7th Cavalry's conduct during these first few minutes reveals a forbidden lack of discipline. Officers lost control of their men, who began to hunt anything that moved through the thick, acrid sulfur smoke. This was the Empire's end of the frontier, not a glorious battle, but a shocking execution of a people who were already starving and freezing. The Black Files later attempted to frame this as a battle of Wounded Knee, but the brutal reality was that the majority of the Lakota casualties were non-combatants. The shocking revelation of the Hotchkiss guns' power was that they didn't just kill, they obliterated. A single shell could wipe out an entire family huddled together for warmth. As the ghost of history looked on, the snowy ground began to steam with the warmth of fresh blood, turning the white landscape into a shocking tableau of red. The untold story of the first 10 minutes is a warning of what happens when strategic mastermind technology is placed in the hands of men fueled by secret files of racial hatred and a need for redemption. Every forbidden shot fired that morning was a nail in the coffin of the American dream for the indigenous nations. The brutal truth is that the 7th Cavalry didn't just fire to pacify, they fired to exterminate the very idea of Lakota sovereignty. As the smoke began to clear and the initial roar of the mountain guns subsided into a shocking silence punctuated only by the moans of the dying, the hidden history transition began. The massacre was moving from the camp center to the surrounding ravines, where the shocking facts of the pursuit would become even more forbidden. The true story of Wounded Knee was no longer about a deaf man and a rifle. It was a final revelation of the brutal reality of American expansion. The black files of the War Department were about to be filled with the shocking names of those who were about to receive medals of honor for this strategic dominance. The ghost of history was now a witness to a crime that no censored report could ever truly wash away. This was the Empire's end, written in the brutal truth of a snowy valley that would never be silent again. If the initial minutes of the Wounded Knee Massacre were a shocking explosion of chaos, then what followed in the hours after the first shots was a brutal reality of systematic execution that remains one of the most forbidden chapters in the history of the United States. To look into the black files of the 7th Cavalry is to descend into a heart of darkness where the lines between military duty and mass murder were not just blurred, but entirely erased by a strategic dominance that lacked any trace of mercy. As the smoke from the Hotchkiss guns drifted across the frozen valley, a new and even more terrifying phase of the untold story began: the pursuit. While standard history books might suggest the firing ended when the camp was destroyed, the hidden history reveals a shocking truth: the slaughter was only getting started. The soldiers of the 7th Cavalry, fueled by a mind-blowing adrenaline and a desire for history reimagined, began to hunt down the survivors who had managed to flee the initial killing zone. These were not warriors with rifles. These were terrified. Women clutching infants to their chests, elderly men whose legs could barely move in the knee-deep snow, and children whose only crime was belonging to a culture the Empire had marked for Empire's end. The brutal truth of the pursuit is that it lasted for miles. The black files contain accounts of soldiers tracking fleeing Lakota across the jagged ravines, firing their Springfield rifles at targets that posed absolutely no threat. This was a power play of the most cowardly sort, a strategic mastermind. Failure where the command structure of the 7th Cavalry completely collapsed into a bloodthirsty mob. Witnesses later described a shocking scene where soldiers would surround a wounded mother and finish her off with a revolver shot to the head, a forbidden act that was later censored from many official military reports. The hidden history tells of the death ravines, where the bodies of the Lakota were found stacked on top of one another, indicating they had sought cover together only to be systematically executed from the ridges above. This wasn't a battle. It was a true story of an extermination. Perhaps the most shocking fact buried within the classified archives of this tragedy is the awarding of the Medals of Honor. In the aftermath of Wounded Knee, the U.S. government issued 20 Medals of Honor to soldiers of the 7th Cavalry for their bravery during the event. To put this into a mind-blowing perspective, that is more medals than were awarded for many major battles of the Civil War or the 2 World Wars. The hidden truth is that these medals were a strategic mastermind, attempted a cover-up, a way to validate a cold-blooded massacre by branding it as a heroic victory. The black files show that even at the time, there were those within the military who were sickened by this. General Nelson Miles, who was in overall command of the department, later described the actions of the 7th Cavalry as the most abominable, criminal military blunder and a horrible massacre of women and children. He attempted to have the commanding officer, Colonel Forsyth, court-martialed, but the power play of politics in Washington ensured that the forbidden truth was suppressed. The Medals of Honor became a warning to history, a symbol of how a nation can use its highest honors to bury its deepest shames. For decades, these medals have stood as a shocking fact of American expansion, a true story of how the victors write the narrative with the blood of the vanished. The untold story of the pursuit is a brutal reality that reminds us that Wounded Knee was not a moment of spontaneous violence, but the final, deliberate act of strategic dominance, intended to break the spirit of the Lakota people forever. The soldiers' faces, which should have shown the discipline of a professional army, were instead etched with a shocking mix of fear and vengeance, their eyes reflecting the ghost of history that they were desperately trying to kill. The style of the 7th Cavalry that day was one of pure, unbridled aggression, a hidden truth of a military unit that had lost its soul. As they returned to the camp center, their blue coats stained with the blood of the families they had hunted. Through the frozen ravines, the snow had turned into a shocking tapestry of red and gray. Every Medal of Honor pinned to a chest that day was a censored memory of a child's scream or a mother's final prayer. The strategic dominance of the United States was affirmed, but at the cost of a moral bankruptcy that would haunt the nation's conscience for centuries. The black files of the 7th Cavalry are not just documents. They are the unsolved mystery of why a nation celebrating liberty chose to reward the slaughter of the defenseless. This is the brutal truth of the American frontier's closing. Not a sunset of glory, but a shocking revelation of how power play can silence the cries of the innocent. As we move into the frozen aftermath, the shocking facts of the mass grave will tell a story that no Medal of Honor could ever truly silence. The true story of Wounded Knee is a hidden history that demands to be heard, a warning that the ghosts of the past never truly sleep until the brutal truth is told in full, without the censorship of the powerful or the sanitization of the standard textbook. 3 days after the screaming had stopped at Wounded Knee Creek, a silence settled over the South Dakota plains that was heavier and more suffocating than the blizzard that had followed the slaughter, a brutal reality that the black files of history struggle to fully contain. The untold story of the aftermath is one of a landscape turned into a frozen gallery of horror where the ghost of history stood witness to a scene so shocking it defied human comprehension. Because a massive snowstorm had swept in immediately after the firing ceased, the bodies of the Lakota, men, women, and infants, were left where they fell, becoming grotesque statues of ice in the sub-zero temperatures. When the burial parties finally arrived on New Year's Day, 1891, they didn't find a battlefield. They found a censored nightmare. The shocking truth preserved by the frost was that many of the victims were frozen in mid-flight or in final acts of maternal protection, their limbs twisted into mind-blowing shapes of agony. This is where the hidden history meets the photographer's lens. George Traeger, a local photographer, arrived with the burial crew to capture images that would become some of the most iconic and shocking facts of the American frontier's empire's end. The most famous of these is the image of Chief Bigfoot, his frozen body half shrouded in snow, his hands stiffened in a final reaching gesture that seemed to plead for the Messiah's promise that never came. We see these characters not as mere statistics, but as a human drama etched in ice. The brutal truth of the burial process was as devoid of dignity as the massacre itself. A mass grave, a long and narrow trench, was hacked into the frozen earth of a nearby hill. The burial crew, a mix of soldiers and paid civilians, moved with a strategic dominance that treated the deceased not as human beings with forgotten tales, but as debris to be cleared. The Untold Story reveals that the bodies were tossed into the pit like cordwood, piled one on top of the other without ceremony, prayer, or even a basic identification. While this shocking scene was unfolding on the ground, a different kind of power play was happening in the newspapers of Chicago, New York, and Omaha. The secret files of the era's media reveal a strategic mastermind effort to spin the massacre as a great victory against a bloodthirsty hostile force. Headlines screamed about a heroic stand by the 7th Cavalry, framing the event as a necessary act of strategic dominance to protect white settlers from the Messiah craze. This was a coded narrative designed to justify the brutal reality to an American public hungry for tales of frontier glory. The hidden truth is that the first reporters on the scene were often embedded with the military, their stories censored by officers who wanted to ensure the black files of the 7th Cavalry remained untarnished. However, the photographs told a different, forbidden story. When Traeger's images began to circulate, they provided a shocking revelation that contradicted the official reports of a battle. You could see the ghost shirts torn by shrapnel. You could see the small frozen bundles that were clearly children. This created a massive misunderstanding in the national conscience, a tension between the heroic legend and the brutal truth captured on film. One of the most mind-blowing and shocking facts of the aftermath was the discovery of a 4-month-old baby girl found alive 4 days after the massacre, huddling beneath the frozen body of her mother. She was named Zintkala Nuni, or Lost Bird, and her survival became a historical legend, yet even her life was turned into a power play, as she was adopted by a white general and used as a living trophy of civilizing the West. The style would depict this child as a symbol of resilience amidst a censored tragedy. The mass grave at Wounded Knee became a warning to all indigenous nations. The empire's end was here, and it was cold, mechanical, and indifferent. The black files of the War Department would later list the event as a battle, but the photographer's lens had already archived the brutal reality of a massacre. Every click of the shutter was a final revelation of the price of expansion, a true story that could not be washed away by 20 medals of honor or 1,000 pages of censored military prose. As the burial crew finally threw the last shovelfuls of dirt over the pile of bodies, the ghost of history didn't just record a date, it recorded a shocking scar on the American soul that would fester for generations. This was the untold story of how a nation tried to bury its conscience in a shallow trench in South Dakota, only for the brutal truth to freeze forever in the eyes of those who dared to look at the photographs. The black files were closed, but the hidden history was just beginning to scream. The silence that followed the final echoes of the Hotchkiss guns at Wounded Knee was not the silence of peace, but a heavy, haunting, brutal reality that signaled the empire's end for the indigenous resistance of the North American continent. To look back at this moment through the lens of hidden history is to realize that the massacre was the bloody exclamation point at the end of a 3-century-long sentence of expansion and conquest. In 1890, the United States Census Bureau officially declared that the frontier no longer existed. There was no longer a discernible line between civilization and the wilderness. Wounded Knee was the shocking revelation that the era of the nomadic warrior and the sovereign Lakota nation was over, crushed under the weight of strategic dominance and industrial-scale warfare. This event left a mind-blowing and permanent scar on the American soul, one that standard history books often try to sanitize as the closing of a chapter rather than the brutal truth of a cultural decapitation. For the Lakota, and indeed for all Native American nations, Wounded Knee represented the final revelation that armed resistance against the federal government was no longer a viable path to survival. The true story of federal-Indian relations shifted from the battlefield to the bureaucracy, where the black files of the Bureau of Indian Affairs would now dictate every aspect of indigenous life, from the food they ate to the language they were forbidden to speak. The hidden truth of this era was the implementation of aggressive assimilation policies, epitomized by the slogan, "Kill the Indian, save the man." Following the massacre, the strategic mastermind of American policy turned toward the total erasure of indigenous identity through institutions like the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, where the children of the survivors were taken to have their hair cut, their clothes replaced, and their heritage censored. This was a power play of the most intimate sort, a forbidden attempt to finish the work of the Hotchkiss guns using the classroom instead of the canyon. The ghost of history still walks the halls of these institutions, reminding us that the shocking violence of Wounded Knee was just the physical manifestation of a deeper, more systematic, strategic dominance. The brutal reality for the survivors was a life of quiet desperation on shrinking reservations, where the forgotten tales of their ancestors were whispered in the dark to avoid the watchful eyes of the Indian agents. This was the untold story of the 20th century for Native Americans, a struggle to maintain a soul in a nation that had officially declared them a vanishing race. For the United States as a whole, Wounded Knee created a shocking psychological paradox. The nation celebrated the winning of the West with Wild West shows and heroic myths, while carefully censoring the brutal truth of how that win was actually achieved. The black files of the 7th Cavalry were buried beneath layers of frontier nostalgia, creating a mind-blowing disconnect between the American ideal of liberty and the brutal reality of its expansion. This scar remains a warning to the modern world about the dangers of unchecked strategic dominance and the othering of cultures that do not fit into the national narrative. The shocking facts of the land disputes and broken treaties that followed Wounded Knee continue to ripple through the 21st century, proving that the empire's end on the plains was merely the beginning of a long, unresolved legal and moral battle for justice. The hidden history of Wounded Knee is not just about a date in 1890, it is a final revelation of the cost of manifest destiny, a true story that challenges every American to look into the forbidden mirrors of the past and acknowledge the blood on the snow. As the frontier closed, the nation moved forward into a new century of global power, yet it carried with it the shocking and silent weight of a massacre that it could never truly outrun. Every time we discuss American history, the ghost of history points back to that frozen creek, a brutal truth that serves as a warning that an empire built on the censored cries of the innocent will always have a hollow core. This was the empire's end for the horse culture of the plains, but it was also the birth of a historical legend of resilience as the Lakota people refused to vanish, carrying the untold story of Wounded Knee as both a burden and a badge of survival into the modern age. The snowy silence of Wounded Knee Creek did not end in 1890. It evolved into a multi-generational brutal reality of unresolved grief and a shocking struggle for the soul of American memory. As we look at the site today, a lonely hilltop marked by a simple stone monument and a rusted wire fence, we are confronted with the hidden history of a nation that is still learning how to tell the true story of its own creation. This final chapter of our Black Files investigation is not just about the past. It is a warning about the present and a mind-blowing testament to the resilience of a people who refuse to let their forgotten tales be buried in a mass grave. For over a century, the official narrative of Wounded Knee was a censored lie, a strategic mastermind effort to frame a cold-blooded massacre as a necessary battle in the glorious march of manifest destiny. But the ghost of history is not so easily silenced. The untold story of the 20th century saw the Lakota people and their allies engaging in a relentless power play for historical justice, a movement that reached a shocking climax in 1973, when members of the American Indian movement occupied the town of Wounded Knee for 71 days. This was a final revelation to the world that the wounds of 1890 were still bleeding, a brutal truth that the empire's end had not resulted in the total disappearance of the indigenous spirit. One of the most shocking facts of our modern era is the ongoing battle over the 20 Medals of Honor awarded to the 7th Cavalry for the slaughter. To this day, descendants of the survivors and activists are pushing for the Remove the Stain Act, a classified struggle to have these honors formally revoked by Congress. They argue that these medals represent a forbidden validation of war crimes and a strategic dominance over the truth that must be corrected for the nation to truly heal. This is the shocking revelation of historical accountability. A medal pinned to a chest in 1891 can still be a key or weapon of censorship in 2026. The hidden history of Wounded Knee is a reminder that justice is not a destination, but a continuous power play against the forces of forgetting. As we conclude this journey into the Black Files, we must ask ourselves, Why these shocking facts were kept from us in our school books, and why the brutal reality of the American frontier is so often replaced by a historical legend of sanitized heroism. The true story is that the massacre was a strategic failure of empathy and a final revelation of what happens when a nation prioritizes strategic dominance over human dignity. But there is hope in the telling of these untold stories. Every time we share the hidden truth, we are participating in a history reimagined, a way to honor the ghost of history and ensure that the screams of the innocent are finally heard. This is the brutal truth of many histories. We do not look back to wallow in tragedy, but to find the strategic mastermind of wisdom that allows us to build a future where such shocking events can never happen again. The Lakota people still gather at the site every December, riding their horses through the freezing winds in a mind-blowing display of ancestral strength, a warning to the world that they are still here, still dancing, and still demanding the true story be told. Now we want to hear from you, the Many Histories community. Do you believe the U.S. government should formally revoke the Medals of Honor given for Wounded Knee, or should they remain as a forbidden testament to a darker time? This is a shocking debate that touches the very heart of American identity, and your voice is a vital part of this historical legend. If this deep dive into the Black Files has opened your eyes to the hidden history of our past, please show your support by hitting the like button and sharing this video with those who seek the brutal truth. Subscribe to Many Histories and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss another shocking revelation or untold story from the archives of the American soul. Your engagement helps us continue to unearth the censored facts and bring the hidden truth to light for a new generation. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective is the strategic mastermind that helps us grow this community of truth seekers. Thank you for walking through the snow with us to find the brutal reality of Wounded Knee. The Black Files are always open for those brave enough to look.